recorded.
Well, then I want to say a absolute wonderful welcome to first to the members of our panel who are going to be joining us for a wonderful conversation, and to a growing number of people who are amongst those attending this conversation as we look at the media in crisis. What are the challenges to media independence, and what are the implications that COVID-19 has in either advancing issues or, in fact, introducing new issues into the balance sheets of news businesses as they try to hold it together, report, keep people informed, etc. I have to say that this is something that I have been looking forward to ever since I agreed to talk about it. And so let me tell you that as part of our global celebration of World Press Freedom Day, this webinar is being presented, and for the next 90 minutes, we're going to tackle at least two main points, but of course we'll move around. What are the long-term threats that are faced by media, both from the public and private interests and disruptions to business models? We're going to hear a lot about the term media capture. What does that mean? And how is that having an influence on the news you get and how it's shaped, formed, and presented? More broadly, what's happening right now with COVID-19? Is it infecting the news business, making the news business sick? And what are any new restrictions that COVID-19 has unleashed through governmental imperatives over safety and concern for public health, restrictions on freedom of expression? I want to tell those people who are joining us and in our community of viewers that you are going to be part of this conversation. So by all means, be prepared. We will be handing it off to you for your questions so that we can hear more from you and get more out of our panel, because Lord only knows that as we get into a conversation, we'll enrich it even more and more. So about halfway through this, in about 30 minutes or so, we'll be opening it up to the floor and taking questions. I do ask the members of our audience to please keep your questions to the point so that we can get to as many as possible. Now, I have got this tremendous, absolutely tremendous panel that is going to be leading us through these issues. Let me introduce them to you, and then we'll get right into it with our Q&A. First of all, I want to welcome Marius Dragomir, who is the director of the Center for Media, Data and Society at Central European University in Budapest, Hungary. Marius will be also previewing the study that he's been working on for UNESCO, reporting facts free from fear or favor.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Ritu Kapoor is co-founder and chief executive officer of The Quint, a news-based, I should say an internet-based, web-based news company based in India. Ritu, thank you for being with us.
Hello, hi, great to be here.
Ferial Haffajee is the associate editor of the Daily Maverick, based in South Africa, and we'll have more on what's happening from their perspective in terms of the issues that we'll be talking about. Ferial, great to have you with us as well.
Thanks, George.
And finally, Ana Cristina Ruela Serna, who is the director of Article 19, in Mexico and Central America, based out of Mexico City, Article 19. And great to have Ana Cristina with us representing the NGO Article 19, which I would say in a nutshell is about freedom of expression for everyone, everywhere.
Thank you very much, George.
Thank you very much, Ana Cristina, for being with us. I'm going to start right now with Marius and Ana Cristina to help us kind of paint a picture of what's happening in the news business, what's trending shall we say, in terms of the conditions that are putting media in jeopardy. Marius, let me jump off with you. What's really keeping you up at night? What's at the top of your worry list when it comes to that threat list of things that are undermining media freedom and, of course, the capacity of news organizations to truly be fruitful in their work? Marius, where are you worried? Where are your worries?
Sure, thank you. As you will see, and as you have seen in some of the previews of the report, I wrote about the threats into two main categories. One is the media capture, which I can speak about and define, and the second is a series of journalistic failings. And of course, there are many other threats that are coming from other directions that I described in the same paper. I'm talking here about spin and public relations, pressures from advertisers, the effects of the tech companies, and especially their business model that is not really supportive of journalism, gender imbalance, and journalism. But of all of that, I think what we are seeing today, and this was a very interesting experience. I cannot find another word, but interesting in the sense that I started writing this paper in December before the whole pandemic crisis started, and I delivered it to UNESCO in March. So you can imagine that it never happened in my life to do such a study in these conditions. And I think it's really important to stress that out of all these threats, I think the media capture is probably the biggest threat to editorial independence.
Give us an idea. When you talk about media capture, I mean, what are you speaking about specifically?
Yes, well, there is an increasing literature on the concept of media capture, attempts to define it by many scholars and many people working also in many journalists working in the field. We have looked at a number of countries and tried to identify the key components, because I think it's really important to really understand the concept by practically looking at what it means, in fact. And we found in our work four key elements, four key components. One is the control of the regulatory authorities and the legislative, the lawmaking bodies. The second component is the control of the state funding, the state resources that are spent in the media. And in many countries, journalism is faced with the misuse of state advertising, for example. The third key component is the control of public service broadcasters and state media that exist in many countries, and usually that happens through control of governing structures and people appointed to manage these bodies. And the fourth, also extremely worrisome element, is the control of private media. And we have seen examples in many countries where oligarchs or companies controlled by oligarchic structures, in many cases allied with governments, have been taking over a lot of the private media. So really, if you look back at these four key components, and I'm sure those working in the field, journalists working in the field, will understand that very well. You look at control over all the structures that have to do with regulations, people who make decisions about who should be licensed to operate and who should not. You have control over public resources, the money that the government spends in the media, and that's actually a key issue because the government has increasing its spending. You have control over the public media, what it is supposed to be public media, and these are usually large institutions. And then you have control over a lot of the private media. In some countries that percentage can be 60%, 70%. So when you achieve that as somebody in the government, and you have the economic power of a class of oligarchs, you can imagine that nothing can actually dismantle your power system. You win elections, and through that you have constant access to public resources. I think you are muted, George.
Right, and I made that mistake and realized when I didn't see smiles on your face when I started to talk, so I jumped on it as quickly as possible. Ana Cristina, what's happening in terms of this? How would you contextualize this for Mexico and for Central America? Are are you seeing these four issues, these four components of media capture playing out in ways that are undermining media freedom, access to information, and also potentially contributing to disinformation or misinformation?
Yeah, well, definitely. I think the document is very clear on that, and I think what Maria did is very interesting because it's actually very related to what we live here in Mexico and in some countries in Central America. And I will make some points about it. First, we think the capture comes through the environment, how the institutions, the legal framework is working. And for example, in places like Cuba, just to have a media house is illegal. To be a journalist and not being a part of a union is illegal. You know, so the restrictions comes through the regulations. It's impossible to have free media or to have free journalism because the government would go against you, and the law, the constitution says so. You know, if you write about something that is considered that goes against the revolution, then they are going to get you, and the security of the states can get you. So it's very difficult for journalists in Cuba to do their work and to do an independent work. And it doesn't have to be about information that is actually like related to huge things. It can be about water, it can be about food. It's just, you know, just if you go against the law. And in Mexico, we also have some kind of that things. And right now, actually, during the pandemic, we're seeing how like all this intents of authoritarianism in different states, in the state level, are coming out. They're trying to criminalize, for example, the diffusion of fake news. They're trying to criminalize things related to data protection, etc. So it's getting worse and worse. During 10 years, the civil society has fought to decriminalize freedom of expression. We right now have only 6 states in Mexico that still criminalizes, for example, crimes against honor, such as defamation, injuries, or something like that. But still, I think the environment for some countries here in Central America and Mexico are complicated. Just recently in Honduras, once the pandemic started, the president launched a decree saying that freedom of expression was not permitted during the pandemic and during the quarantine. He had to retract it after a huge demonstration, but I think it's a way to see how governments try to capture media. And I think there's another issue that is very, very clear here in Latin America, and is related to how governments spend money on governmental advertising, trying to create propaganda. Actually, there's not about information, it's about propaganda. And here, for example, in Mexico, a government can spend more than they spend on education, books, or things like that for propaganda. And that means that media here in Mexico can depend in 60%, 70% on public money, which actually means that they are public or official media. And the problem is that these 6 billion pesos that goes to public advertising actually are sent to 53%. Like 53% of this money is going only to 10 families. And the other 48%, 47% is going to 250 media, different owners. So actually all the information that comes out here in Mexico is controlled by 10 people, you know, and that's very boring and very problematic for pluralism. And we can see it more deeper here right now in the pandemic. You know, like the information plays a huge role. The new government, the government of Andrés Manuel, actually reduced the money that is paid for the media in 500%, which means also that media is showing muscle in this moment and trying to gain again all the privilege that they have in the previous government. So it's getting rough. We're seeing how financing, public financing, can play a very difficult role for society in the type of information we're getting. And right now, who's in the middle? It's society who's trying to understand what's the truth. So I do believe that these are very, very huge risks for media capture.
Thank you very much, Anna. That's a bit of a chilling, I would say, a bit of a chilling description of what's happening in terms of the free flow of information. I'm going to switch over to Rita and to Ferial because they're news companies. They are producing content on their news websites, and curious to see it from the side of those who are engaged in the reporting and of course the managing of news businesses in particular. You know, I was looking at both of your websites, Ferial and Ritu, and I have to say, I mean, what I see is something kind of, well, I would say very different. You're edgy, you're bold, you're brash. I mean, clearly, you are not either the Hindustan Times or the Sunday Times. You're really kind of to define a place for yourselves. But in all of that, and of course, in what you're producing, are you finding, and I'll start with you, Ritu, are you finding that you're in a narrowing sphere of press freedom? Are the walls closing in on you and on the work that you're doing?
You know, the fact that India ranks 142nd on world press freedom, I mean, that speaks out of 180 countries. You know, that should speak volume. That there would be those who would say, you know, that's, you're seeing that number because there are huge number of internet shutdowns in Kashmir in India, and which is why we skew so low in press freedom. But I can tell you that being in the thick of things, that it has been very tough, and it is getting tougher. And unfortunately, with this epidemic or pandemic throwing all sorts of economic situations into complete jeopardy, things are, to be independent and to be free and to speak your mind in India right now is getting tougher. I can tell you that even as we speak, there are 2 journalists from Kashmir who've been slapped with a very draconian law, which is the unlawful activities, which is an ancient imperial law that is being imposed on people. There have been an unprecedented number of legal cases that journalists like us, the Quint is of course embroiled in several legal matters that we are caught up with. But I think the biggest sort of squeeze and choking comes through holding back on denial of any kind of approvals, of licenses, a lot of what was referred to earlier. And it's either sort of drags on forever and sort of just fatigues you and exhausts you out of somehow finding some other way of getting the news or the important views out, or there's a complete, after an interminable wait, there's a complete denial, and there is no explanation for why the denial has come. And we at the Quint have been dealing with it, but I can tell you that a lot of media houses that are not crawling and that are not sort of either polarizers or propagandists, or all of that, we're all dealing with it here. So it's closing in, and yet it provides an opportunity to be in an environment where media is crawling to be an independent voice. So it's strangely a time of opportunity as well, because this is also the time that India is seeing some of the best journalism. So it's a strange situation that we are in.
Ferial, in South Africa, the circumstances, are they mirroring the concerns and examples that we're seeing in India, and also in terms of what was described more broadly for Mexico and Central America?
So, George, I'm going to start with 3 positive trends, if I may.
Oh, I love that.
Because I think it's also a moment of opportunity. So at the Daily Maverick and indeed around the world, you've seen people flocking to credible news sites. So you've seen the COVID bump almost everywhere, and that's in South Africa and the rest of Africa too. So that's been very good. The other positive trend I wanted to speak out about in the light of Marius's paper, is that here you're seeing the value of good philanthropic investments. So we've got 3 health news agencies which are really leading the country in understanding the epidemiology, the science, the health of the moment. Very important when you've seen the evisceration of beat reporting everywhere in the world. And then finally, because we successfully lobbied against the capture of our public broadcaster in years and years of court cases, our public broadcaster here is doing the essential service of getting this message out beyond the elites and into the tiny parts of our country. Can we yet attribute our relatively flat curve to that? We'll only be able to tell at the end once the epidemic peaks. But those are, I think, fairly good news stories. On the other hand, our continent and our country is a story of thousands of jobs being lost. I mean, as I speak to you today, one of the biggest magazine groups has shut down. Friday, another one. So I think magazines are not going to make it through the fire. In many parts of the world, it's a jackboot response, and journalists are being caught in the crossfire. Last week, the UN noted that in 18 countries, the police were being so heavy-handed, and when you track those 18 countries, journalists are often at the front line of police or army abuses. And just the final one is quackery. Quackery is very big. So at the weekend, you saw the Madagascan leader saying that he had found something called COVID organics and it was the cure. And I think in an era where it's also an infodemic of misinformation and of disinformation, the value of a credible journalistic force, an army, is showing itself to be perhaps more valuable than any time in the 21st century thus far. Are we meeting that challenge? I suppose that's something for us to discuss. And then just last point, if I may, I think it's important that we also speak about platform capture. Is this new Luminate $1 billion fund, is it that's going to be co-funded by the tech platforms? Is that the panacea? Is that what's going to save independent journalism? I'd love to hear what some of my colleagues feel about that. Quite exciting development on the one hand, but also many questions about it.
Let me ask Ferial, at the start of the conversation, you started out with, among the positives was the fact that people are flocking to reputable, shall we say, reputable news sites, but how are they making that determination? I mean, you know, reputable for me might not be reputable for you. We all have our different parameters. What is distinguishing the reputable or defining the reputable as something that we might all agree as a panel, and maybe even those in our audience who would agree are those news sites that are putting up verifiable fact stories in a narrative that explain what is happening, and again based on having verified that news and information thoroughly. So where's the media literacy in South Africa? Are you telling me that it's really that good?
Well, I think that every country has a system of measuring. And so these global studies have used those national systems to show you that there has been a flocking away from the platforms as a source of information to your, not old news sites, but the biggest news sites. And in our case, we're not the biggest, but certainly we are in the top 10, and we can instantly see that bump. So there are many studies which are showing that, but perhaps my colleagues in other countries can say whether that's true or not for them.
I'll go to Ritu. Is it true for you?
I think it's true to some extent, but I think the overall mind capture, if we can look beyond media capture, mind capture is in our country is dominating. But I think when you're putting out content or news from the ground, which you cannot, where you have voices from the ground or you have clear evidence, visual evidence from the ground, I think we're finding that those stories are traveling a lot. Also, the fact we are finding a huge surge of traffic to our fact checking. We have a fact checking team and right now, Ferial mentioned quackery in India. There is fake news which has gone way beyond just the disease. It's there has been a communal simmering and a polarization that's existed over the last 4 or 5 years, which reached a head towards the end of last year with the Citizenship Act coming into India, which indirectly was making it very difficult for Muslims who were seeking refuge from other countries to find citizenship in the country. And there was further polarization during that. And what we're seeing, unfortunately, is in the context of the pandemic, there is a surge of fake news, which is basically effectively saying that Muslims are spreaders, are the super spreaders, and therefore stay away from them, don't buy anything from them, and sort of banish them from the country or part them off to Pakistan if you can. And we are finding more than ever before, when we are doing fact checking on this content, people are flocking to it. So while you might have your confirmation bias kicking in when you're just reading an opinion piece, when you're doing ground reporting and when you're doing fact checking, we're finding a lot of people who would otherwise go to the legacy media, which may not be doing as much ground reporting anymore, especially not television. We're finding that they're coming to us for that. So we are seeing a surge, definitely. Unfortunately, in India, we have WhatsApp, which is actually perceived to be a source of news, but it is not. The source is, of course, not known. And the spread of any fake news or any misinformation or disinformation or malinformation is infodemic on overdrive, or infodemic on steroids. So combating that is still a huge issue in our country.
Are you using WhatsApp as a way of directing people to your platform? In other words, get in the middle of the muck and say, well, if you want to think that you're okay, but you're not going to survive till tomorrow, if you want to find out how to, come to me. See what we're doing over at the Quint.
So we do that. We also use WhatsApp. You have a channel open on WhatsApp, asking people to send in anything that they find fake or suspicious. So we also use our WhatsApp channel for media literacy on how to look out, how to confirm whether something is coming from a credible source. And in fact, that's worked very well for us because so much of this fake news travels within the dark web, and I'm referring to it, WhatsApp as dark web as well. We've built a relationship of trust with our readers over the last couple of years, saying, listen, if you find something suspicious, send it to us, we'll fact check and get back to you. And we'll also publish it, and if you like, with your name as a flagger of the fake news. And we're finding that that's worked out really well for this situation right now. So the trust comes not just from what you're giving them, but also from the participation that they can have. And we try and publish the fact check news on WhatsApp with the same keywords that are being used to push out the fake news, so that it rides on the same virality and gets consumed as much.
Ana Cristina, you've been working on a policy paper on misinformation, fake news. What you're hearing now from the implementers, from the journalists, how is that mirroring and matching up with what your research is showing in that policy paper?
Well, definitely, I think misinformation comes from different sources, and it's important for us to identify those sources in order to, for us as readers, as audience, to identify the sources and to try to know that sometimes when we are navigating on the internet, we are exposed to that kind of information, even when we are not navigating in internet. As I say before, the media capture what creates is a lot of disinformation. In Mexico, for example, the greatest source of disinformation historically has been the state. So I think it's important just to demystify the disinformation as something that is just created in this moment right now with the digital era. It has come from the story, you know, like it's part of the story of the world. And we as audiences have to identify the sources and the intentions of the sources in order to decide what we want to believe. I just believe right now that the biggest risk, and that's what is happening, comes to the most vulnerable communities that do not have the opportunity to cross the sources, to identify or to try to look for another sources. That's the problem about the lack of pluralism. You know, in the places where indigent communities are, the only source that they have is the one that they get, and that's the information that they can gather. So if that source is giving hate speech information or discrimination information, then they are going to believe it. That is what's happening right now, for example, in some of the indigent communities here in Mexico, where some of the people are just not letting people that is sick in, and they are letting them die outside the community. That is happening right now because of misinformation. So I think actually there's a lot to do from media houses, not only from digital media houses, because actually the ones that have access to internet have the opportunity to counter information, but it's also important for governments to consider that information and counter speech can come from, for example, community radio stations that have to bring the information and the counter narratives in order to fight for misinformation. I also think that it's very important for journalists to verify and double check, because and not only to say that something is fake, because what we see right now and what we have seen in different countries here in Central America and Mexico is that we know that it's fake, but we do not know what is true. So it is important to mix both, you know, to say, yeah, this is fake, but this is the truth. Because sometimes some journalists lose or do not remember to tell us what is actually what is the counter speech. And I think, and I also think, as Ferial said, here in Mexico, what we have had during this time is that even though there's a lot of media capture, we have seen the proliferation of independent media in a very good way, different type of economic processes that have brought together in order to bring better and good journalism to the people. And I think it's very interesting because it comes when violence and capture is more like bright here in Mexico. And I think it's because actually right now within the crisis, media is finding itself in the essentiality, you know, as doctors are essentials, as nurses are essentials, also media is essential, because it's the only one that is going to let us go out in someday and know what we are going to do after.
Ana Cristina, I like the fact that you brought up media capture, because I was going to point the finger next at Marius, because I want to see Marius perhaps bring this issue of disinformation and media capture. How are they linked? Is there evidence that there is the potential for more disinformation moving into communities as a result of media capture?
Wow.
And while you're thinking about that for 1 second, I'm going to tell our audience that we're going to move to the audience to be posing other questions for us to engage with them as well, so that we bring them into the conversation. But before we do that, Marius, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Yes, the simple answer to your question is yes, and to a large extent. And well, building on what Ana Cristina just said, I think while we while we understand that the misinformation phenomenon is very serious and it affects how people get informed and how people, what kind of information people consume and how they react based on that information, I think there is something fake in this fake news story, extremely fake. And this has to do with the fact that because of the capture and because of the access of governments and states to, as I explained, to resources that they spend in the media, quite significant, to media outlets, both private and public, they also are the key agents of misinformation in many countries, and they can do that very easily simply because of this access to platforms, to media outlets, to funding, to everything essentially. So I think it's time. It's really important, of course, to continue supporting media literacy projects, and I really believe that there is a need for that in the sector. But at the same time, I think we have to look back again at the structural problems of media systems, the very problems that actually prevent journalists in many countries in doing their job. And misinformation is a huge part of that.
Again, I just want to let our audience know that we're going to be taking some questions from you. So there is a process here that allows us to do this in a very organized way. You have the capacity to raise your hand electronically. You'll see it next to your name. There should be a little hand that you can activate, and then through that we will be able to. I see people already. We have a very smart group of people in our audience. I didn't even have to finish the explanation and they're already raising their hands. And as people are getting their thoughts together and getting ready to pose some very good questions to all of you, Ferial, when you were conceiving your business model, could you ever have conceived of COVID-19? How was COVID-19, how has that thrown a spanner in the works for you?
Well, I think all of us wish that we'd been listening a little more closely to Bill Gates when he made that speech last year, and what he's been doing all along. But certainly it's for the Daily Maverick a black swan, but a good one, because the years and years of investment in high quality journalism means that you have a ready base of experts able to do the necessary investigations. And I don't only want to speak about our platform, but more broadly, I think across our continent, where you've seen investments either by philanthropists or by local entrepreneurs, you're seeing a similar outcome. What worries me, though, is newspapers are going to the wall really, really quickly. I think this is the extinction event for magazines and newspapers. I know we've been speaking about that for a long time. But with the delivery system lost due to lockdowns, PDF copies are going around the web. And across our continent, many journalists are finding themselves without work, not regarded as essential services. They weren't classified as such. And in pretty dire straits, George. I think that's also going to be with us for the next decade if we're talking about independent media.
Okay, so that doesn't necessarily bode well. I mean, there's a mixed bag there. You've gotten people to kind of take you seriously, even more so, but yet there's a lot of fragility in the news economy. Yes,
because of the stage where our media development is at.
Rita, your situation similar, or how is it different in India?
I'll speak for the Quint. We've been, it's what COVID-19 has done for us is it's pushed us to think, while we thought we were still in the building out mode, we're still in the investing phase, we're still in the growing phase, to stop and be viable on the go. I think I will be viable sometime later in the future when the world is a beautiful place. I don't think that's going to ever happen, is what COVID-19 has brought home to us. I think a few things that we built out, like I talked about our fact checking, which has been so effective through this period. The other model that worked very well for us was our citizen journalism model. We've had, at a time when our journalists can't be everywhere, we've had our citizen journalists, it's a relationship that's been built over 5 years, who have been, bringing us stories, and we had already built in a mechanism of verifying stories that are coming in from citizen journalists. So I think some of those things have worked for us. I think one of the things that's really made us stop and think is, what is a viable model for a digital-only, digital-first, independent media house? Because to be independent, It's not just good enough to survive. To be independent, you have to now be viable. And we are self-funded largely. We are advertiser-funded and self-funded. But I think now has really forced us to look at what are viable models for news media, and all the conversations that I'm having with publishers, legacy publishers, smaller publishers, is everyone's looking at viability right now, which unfortunately is going to have a not very happy side to it. Fidel talked about journalists being without jobs, some media houses shutting down. But I think this has been a real wake-up call.
Okay, I think at this time, as we transition over to the audience, I'm going to give a shout out to Anya Schifrin, who is the Director of Technology, Media, and Communications at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. Anya, it's good to have you with us in the audience. And the reason I turned to you is just to maybe get a comment from you on the conversation. And you would do that, I think, from a very informed point of view from the fact that in 2017, you authored In the Service of Power, Media Capture and the Threat to Democracy. Anya, if we could turn on your microphone, we'd hope to hear some comments from you as we get and dive into the audience pool.
Sure. I hope there's not a lot of background noise. People keep complaining that there's too many sirens in the background in New York, but right now it seems quieter. Yeah, thank you. I think sort of media capture, as Marius and others well know, was originally sort of an arcane economics term. And we had a conference in 2016, which many of us attended, that really tried to sort of introduce the concept to the world of journalism, which had often been worried about ownership for sure, but our argument was that the digital era had dramatically changed media capture, and that the original people, economists who'd studied the phenomenon, had assumed that markets would work, and that when you had lower barriers to entry because of the internet, you would get more of a supply of media outlets, and that this competition would lead to higher quality. And our argument was actually the opposite happened, that all the competition led to a race to the bottom as people tried to generate revenues. So what we wanted to highlight was really this new phenomenon of how media capture was playing out in the digital age. And then of course the rise, as you've all very much discussed, the Modis of this world or the Erdogans of this world, or what's happened in the part of the world that Marius is an expert in. Which in a way had always been true in Latin America, where you had media outlets that were really in the service of the power of the state and working with them. So yeah, we edited 2 volumes. The third one is coming out in the fall, which looks just at the tech companies and includes testimony from journalists. So I think, you know, you've all described a process that's becoming more and more familiar to journalists and to citizens around the world, and seems to be really accelerating. And obviously there's different manifestations in different places, and there's obviously outlets and alternative voices in every place. So Daily Maverick would be a great example for South Africa. But it's definitely, I think, when we do think about pressure and press freedom, we can't escape capture anymore. So thank you. I'd love to hear the comments from other people.
Marius, let me ask you to come in on that part of the conversation and just respond to what Anya Schifrin brought to the floor.
Yes, I totally agree. Great to hear you, Anya. Definitely, what we all expected, and a big part of the model that we looked at when we analyzed the various forms of media capture in a number of countries is technology and the internet. And it is true, journalists expected that the internet and these digital times will offer journalists immense opportunities to actually avoid and circumvent all these forms of capture and pressures from the governments. But it's not, in fact, that easy. The capture, and somebody asked me at some point, what is the difference between the current models of media capture that we have today in many countries in the world and the old forms of ownership control, concentration of ownership, and that existed in the 90s and then in 2000s. And the difference, I would say, is the the bigger collusion these days between governments and oligarchs. Those of you who remember the days when Berlusconi was the prime minister of Italy, and he controlled at the same time the largest private broadcaster in the country, this is probably the closest to the forms of media capture that we have today, because when he was in power, he controlled some of the public television in Italy, and at the same time, he controlled the largest television stations in the country, which was already a big part and a very high level of capture and concentration of ownership. But that is nothing compared to situations today where the government basically controls everything. If you have control over regulatory frameworks, public funding, public media, and 60%, 70% of private media, basically you will be in power forever. And this is the case that we see today. And that means, of course, that you have access to resources and you can keep controlling the media. What is happening there, the key point is that, of course, the large technology companies have a bigger role to play, but at the same time, this very high level of control of regulations is also playing into this capture model, because simply, and we see already in a number of European countries, governments are moving very fast to regulate the internet. We have, especially during this crisis, when these big news are buried by the pandemic coverage, governments are adopting a lot of legislation, a lot of laws that are going to have a long-lasting impact on the media. And one of them is basically control of the content on the internet.
Ritu, I saw you nodding there. Did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, the point that Marius is making about the ownership of media directly and indirectly, both, because in India as well, it is most of the media, and I would say about 75 to 80% of the media is owned by just 2 or 3 corporates. And there's a lot of issues of transparency. So you know, if you try and look for ownership, you will find very complicated structures which help in the opacity of trying to find out who really owns it. And all the large corporates have other larger businesses. Media is just like a small part of their business. Larger businesses which depend on the government for the regulatory clearances and other blessings that they need, and that then has an impact on the news media that they own. And so I was just nodding my head because I see that up close and personal. And on the other hand, it is getting tougher and tougher for independent media to survive because corporates who would advertise for news media are also being careful about where they're putting their ads, because they may or may not want to be seen as directly or indirectly supporting media that is inconvenient to the powers that be. So there's multiple ways in which the nexus of the oligarchs and the government works, which I'm sure Marius has written far more in detail about. It's just that I could relate and understand what he was talking about.
Ferial, your hand's up, and then we're going to go out to the audience. What is your comment on this?
I just wanted to share an insalubrious webinar I sat on Sunday with our industry, where there was a lady from Facebook who was kind of almost held up as a demigod because they're putting some money into a pot and people are feeling their very survival to be at stake. And I just felt that that's not a good way for the world to work, because everybody was begging them for a little in. And for me, Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey they're super oligarchs of today, and surely platform capture should be a part of a bigger conversation now about, is this 1 billion Rand Luminate fund that will be maybe a third funded by the platforms, but over which they won't have control? Is that good for media democracy? It struck me as Marius was speaking that conversation with Facebook on Sunday here made me so uncomfortable because it was almost neo-colonial.
Then let's go to the audience, but we're gonna continue this part of the conversation because I want to hear more about what our panelists have to say. But I've made a promise, and I'm going to go to Augustine Antovan, and maybe Augustine, you have a comment on what Ferial has just said, which is on these issues of platform capture. What are these tech companies doing? Is it from the goodness of their heart, or are we seeing the emergence of a new type of oligarchy? Augustine, the floor is yours. Oh, I'm having a bit of a hard time unmuting Augustine's phone, or I should say microphone. Perhaps one of my colleagues can do it. And there you are. Augustine, you're live. And we're looking forward to hearing from you. Go ahead.
Yeah, George, can you hear me now, George?
We certainly can. Go ahead, Augustine.
Okay, so I think basically, in a nutshell, most of the time, these companies, they're basically looking at their survival. I mean, they're in it for the long run, and they will do whatever is necessary, try to abide by some of the laws, and the laws vary from country to country. And so it's the survival mode, because they control a huge amount of information going back and forth. And COVID-19 has created a very realistic picture when people are staying at home. The question now is, where are people going to access information, and what kind of portals are they going to get information? But I was going to type a question, but since I'm online, I wanted to pose the question back to the panel. I'm a strong advocate of media literacy, but I personally feel that critical thinking alone is not enough. And there is a need to care about truth and society. What does the panel think about this? Is that utopia or doable?
About truth and society. Ana Cristina, what do you think about truth and society?
Well, definitely, I think it's important I think when, in the case of the countries I work at, one of the biggest findings that we have is that in many universities, when they teach journalism, they do not tell them that the product of their work is a good for the society. And they find out while they're working. And I think that's a huge thing that universities have to do with journalism, because as long as the journalists understanding from the beginning that everything that they do is not theirs, is ours, and that we decide from that good what we are going to do after, it's in the time when they think about the truth and society. I also think it's very difficult for some journalists to be truthful and to be and to think on society when they have to think on eating. There are many journalists, for example, here in Mexico, that are paid for the article that is published, and if that article touches some of the advertisers, then they are not going to publish, so they are not going to get paid. So sometimes it's very difficult also to maintain independence when you have behind you the deck of we say here in Mexico, if you're not killed by the gun, you're killed by the money, because the money is the one that is also always teaching you what you have to say. Because here in Mexico, even though you have many places as Mexico City, for example, where you can rely on other sources of money or financing, there are places as Oaxaca where the only money is public money. So it's not easy to find another way to survive, and they have to stick with it. So they are doing great journalism, trying to go against all the things that that are against them, or the obstacles, but still for society, just to think about society and truthfulness would mean also that many journalists would have to die of hunger. So it's a very difficult thing to balance. I think what we have to achieve is to have a stronger community, for example, community media. I think that we have to stop, like in the case of Mexico, one of the biggest ways to capture the possibility for people that is in vulnerable communities is to reduce the permissions for community radio stations. And that means that community radio stations that are the ones that are getting to those places do not have the reach in order to go for it. So I do think that there's many other like many things that are around the problem, and that the only way to fight it is not about only the willingness of the journalists, because I'm sure many of them have them. You know, I don't think that they do not like. I don't think that any journalists like to be told what they have to write. But sometimes, you know, reality runs over you.
Julie Passetti, I know that you've got a question that is in line with, I think, the train that we've put on this track, which is about accountability around social media, holding those companies accountable. Pose your question, Julie. I look forward to hearing the response from our panelists, and also comments from our audience as well. Julie, the floor is yours.
Thanks, George, and hello, everybody. Ferial mentioned a term, platform capture, which is a term that research colleagues and I coined at the Reuters Institute in two reports that actually focused on two of the news organizations you have in focus here, one being the Quint Reach News organization and the other being Ferial's Daily Maverick. And one of the points we made at that stage, which was just less than 6 months ago, in fact, when the final report came out, was that we were seeing a shift away from codependence or overdependence on the social platforms, and we were seeing more kind of accountability journalism focused on the platforms to try and avoid the sort of capture that we'd identified had led to a decline in the independence and ability to, in fact, curate audiences in ways that were not dependent upon the platforms. We've seen a reversal of that now in the context of COVID-19. We're also seeing almost a sort of an amnesia, as I would suggest, around the issues we had started to acknowledge flowing from analysis of Cambridge Analytica, from Bell Pottinger and other big scandals around the world that problematize this relationship with the social media companies. So my question is really, goes further than what the important flags that Ferial was raising. How do we, as a community of journalists and researchers and NGOs and media freedom activists, many of whom are benefiting from large chunks of money that the platforms are offering, how do we ensure that we maintain critical independent reportage on those platforms and without the effect of this amnesia that I'm describing? And how do we also try to ensure we can build these deeper, narrower, stronger relationships with our audiences built on trust that prevent us from having to be so dependent on the platforms?
Rita, let me ask you to kick it off. How is it that you think you are achieving a level of trust with your audience? How do you define trust in the news?
Trust is very difficult to define in terms of news, because it's a constantly changing dynamic which is happening in the news space all the time, and you have to constantly tell yourself as journalists that you're not going to be swayed by anything else other than bringing in the news factually, correctly, bring the truth in. And I think once you have to do this not once, not twice, but you have to do it for years. You have to do it every day. You have to do it at the cost of an advertiser going away. You have to do it at the cost of the powers that be not being very happy with you. And I think that's something for people to perceive over time. I don't think that happens with one big news break. But I'm just going to circle back to what Julie raised and what Ferial had raised, because I feel pretty strongly about that. Because if we agree that independent news is a public good, as Anna said, it is a need, then we need to be able to create a news economy that is not having to look to the governments or having to look to advertisers. And I think if you look at the platforms, it's a symbiotic relationship, right? So if news is a public good and the platforms say that they value public good and they value content, then they have to participate in a fair share or a fair exchange of value. It can't be they can't have this big brother approach of grants and, special, which in any case, I can tell you that a lot of that doesn't reach the global south by the time, a lot of it, the minute you see a grant, you try and apply for it, you know that it's Europe-centric or US-centric. But that aside, it has to be, if we agree that they have the tech and distribution, and we have the truth or value or in terms of opinion and analysis as well, then, and people are going to search or socially exchange that value that we are bringing, then I think more than ever before, now it's important well, in Australia and France, it's the state that's doing it. But I think it's increasingly important for all of us who compete with each other for now to come together and say and demand a healthy news economy, of where the platforms step out from the capture and participate in the news economy. Because if they kill, if news media dies, then it impacts them. And if you're able to understand that, then I think it is really, really important. We know that we cannot get commitments from the state to keep news media alive beyond a point. It has to be the forces of economics that have to make it happen.
The currency of that economics is trust, is it not? I mean, if I don't trust you, then you're out to lunch. So we have one of our a member of our audience, Ferial, who makes this bold statement. She says, most journalists are propagandists. The codes of ethics are just meaningless, and the media regulators are derelict. How do you respond, Ferial?
I don't think that you can make such a bold statement. That obviously there are many terrible examples, but if this COVID-19 moment is showing us anything, it's the value of trusted news media. The other thing it's showing us is that the platforms can actually be good global citizens, because they've been taking down misinformation and disinformation at a pace we've never ever seen before, and they've been privileging important information about this pandemic because so many people flock to those platforms. And that's a standard, it's a gold standard, and we should hold them to that. Why I think our colleague, I'd love to know where they're from, that's probably true for large swathes of the world, but it's also untrue for many other parts where important struggles have been waged to ensure that big parts of the media remain free and remain independent, or small parts, and we have to keep pushing open that door.
Well, I'll have to ask Katja Stiletti, who wrote something in the chat, to let us know if she's part of any particular organization or not. Everybody's welcome here to contribute to the conversation regardless. I want to move to Primavera Teles Giron, who is with the Network for Freedom of Expression Against Violence Against Communicators in Mexico. And she's got a question on what's happening in terms of, well, I'll let her ask the question. Why should I have to categorize it? I'm not in any particularly privileged position. So Primavera, the floor is yours. If I can unmute your microphone, but sometimes I can, sometimes I can't. Yeah, there you go. You're live. Primavera, pose your question. Go ahead, Primavera. All right, we seem to be having a problem. I'll read from what she wrote. To the whole panel, she says, what role are the governments playing, the prime ministers, presidents in their countries, to manipulate the information, especially because in some countries, they are the ones who disseminate the fake news and classify the journalists and the media that criticize them as fake news, especially now in COVID-19 times. Marius, why don't you take that one?
Yes, yes, sure. Thank you. Absolutely, I totally agree with that, and we spoke about that, and in a vast number of countries, indeed, there is a very dangerous trend that we see, with governments in the controlling position of the media sector, and at the same time making laws and addressing this issue. And I think that we are in a trap with this fake news phenomenon that many governments are using it at the maximum, especially at these times of crisis. While many of them are indeed the biggest source of misinformation in many countries, the attention of researchers and journalists is somewhere else. But at the same time, what is really dangerous is the fact that many of these governments, they also make laws, adopt laws to combat misinformation. And this is probably the most worrisome trend that I've seen in recent years. And the most inappropriate reaction, I would say, of the governments to these issues. We already seen in a number of countries in all places, including Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, governments adopting law and regulations against disinformation. They define fake news and misinformation, and they make decisions about content that they define as such. They shouldn't have any say in this. This is an issue that should be solved and addressed by the industry, by journalists, by fact checkers, in no case by the government. So I think this is really a big problem, and in fact it's being this trend, we see this trend being accelerated during these times of crisis, again, for many reasons, because in some cases people do not pay attention. In other cases, these days they have a very strong argument. They claim that combating fake news through this kind of legislation and regulations is saving lives. So I think there is a lot of hypocrisy there, and probably one of the most dangerous trends in regulation that we have seen in recent years.
Ana Cristina, do you want to add to Marius's comment or diverge?
Yeah, well, just adding I think we have to be very careful on the stigmatization of the press. I believe that, as Ferial said, even though we have some environments where all media seems to be captured, still there are places where journalists and independent journalists comes out. In the case of Mexico, for example, I can say that many of the journalist investigations are the ones that have open investigations that haven't, like against governors, against the ministers of the security house, many things, like many things that the prosecutors or the criminal investigation haven't done, the journalists have done it. I mean, like cases as I think that everyone knows the disappearance of the 43 students in Ayotzinapa, or the extrajudicial executions that happens mostly every day here in Mexico, have been known thanks to the journalist work. And I think that's important to say, because sometimes we believe that everything is about propaganda, but I think there are lights on the proliferation of very good journalism that is leading to the change of life. Because in the case of like Ayotzinapa, or in the case of Tlatlaya, no one has actually gone to jail now, but people know that happened. And before, in the 1960s, we did not know that there was a 300 student massacre, because the media was totally captured here in Mexico. So I think there has been a good evolution. And I think media is trying to open the bridge in a very good way. I also think that there's a huge risk on listening to the stigmatization, because what is creating, like this narrative that comes mostly from the government, in the case of Mexico, this narrative that says that all journalists are propagandists, or that all journalists are sold, divide the society and the audience from the journalists, and creates a very violent environment for journalists. Here in Mexico, when they kill a journalist, that it's almost every 3 weeks, no one goes out and protest because of the killing. And then after years, we saw that the investigation of the journalist was related to a huge corruption issue, to some of the governors or something like that. So we have to be careful on the stigmatization, and not listening that much to what the government is saying, because for them it's very useful to separate us as a society to journalism.
But good journalism that is based on verifiable fact told in a compelling narrative with empathy, bringing the community, the individual into the community and the community to the story. Sounds like it should be the recipe for a viable and healthy, economically healthy news organization. And yet we see that there are many news organizations out there who whose manipulation of the news is actually their formula for moving the pesos, the dollars, the pounds, the lira. So, you know, I have two people on this panel who represent what are clearly news organizations that are trying to tell the story, trying to get to the facts, trying to speak truth to power. And there are a host of other news organizations out there who are doing the exact opposite and are succeeding. So what's the business model that works here? If it's not going to be based on the real basic principle of what is news. Marius, what's the business model?
Yes, thank you. Well, I think there are two things to say here. One is, yes, indeed, journalistic content, that compelling journalistic content should sell and should be sought by readers. And we have an increasing number of cases in many countries where subscription-based models are practically the ones that really work. And they work for a very important reason. And that reason is the link that such models establish between your audience and the media outlet. In other words, people who really trust you, speaking about trust, will vote with their wallets. And it happens in many countries, but we run into many other problems. One of them being that usually the most affluent types of readers are subscribing, and usually these people are also the most informed people. And that doesn't solve a bigger problem that we have, which is the problem of the disconnected people, of the people that are targeted by capture media outlets and by the large state control companies. So this is one thing. It's hard to say, of course, what is the best model or the most working model, but this is something that we see growing in a number of countries. And I think, in fact, with this crisis, that is going to suffer as a financial crisis will definitely follow that. And the second thing that I think we should discuss is, yes, I started to write the other day a paper about the world of two journalisms. And I think we live in a world of two journalisms. On the one hand, this is just to respond to some of the accusations that we hear here, that all journalists are propagandizing and all these things. We live in many countries. We see a world of journalism that is lavishly funded by governments. We spoke about that a lot in this conversation about the capture. In fact, in many countries, this sector of media outlets controlled by the government, private media outlet, public media outlets, and the others, they employ sometimes 70% of the journalists. They're still journalists, they produce content in the country. And then we have the rest, people like our friends here on the panel and people from the very few media outlets left independent that are trying to actually compete on that market. So we are talking about a huge imbalance here. And usually that imbalance stems from the financial power of these groups of oligarchs, state-controlled media, and other companies. So there is a problem there that I think we should address. And finally, and this is linked to another question I think Julie asked when talking about the platform capture, what we should do. And yes, there is a major issue of the platform capture. At the same time, I think we should think about how we can address that locally, because most of the media captures are built within local, national markets where governments are trying to take control over media, access, distribution of content, and the rest. And of course, the large technology companies play a huge role in distributing content. But what can be done and what should be done is to look back and to look more into the policies that are being adopted or not covering these technology companies. In other words, we need policies, we need rules for these companies, and unfortunately, NGOs, journalists are not sitting at the table. I think that's an issue that we should look more in the future, because a lot will depend, or the fate or the future of independent journalism will depend on how these large distribution networks will be regulated at local or, I don't know, regional level.
Ritu Kapoor, are you ready to take Facebook money?
Absolutely.
And why then?
But preferably not just as special grants, but more as partnerships. Like we appreciate the partnership that we have with Facebook on fact checking. That's not just in terms of a grant. It's value for a certain truth-seeking work that is done, and then I think that if 70% of ad revenue is going to the platforms, and platforms are also thriving on what news media is creating as content, then I think there has to be a taking back of our share of the revenue. I think that definitely, I wouldn't have a problem with that. I mean, I'd much rather be able to do good work using that revenue than not do the important journalism and stand on some principle.
Ferial, are you on the same in the same space?
I thought I might just say, tell you a little bit about the member model that Quint and the Daily Maverick do. So on the night when the first lockdown light was declared here, we asked our members what's top of mind. And they flooded us with 1,000 questions, which we then bust our gut to answer in a day. And those kind of trust building where people come to you because these are anxiety provoking and difficult times, for me, developing that audience, and many of them pay us to be part of the insider community. They co-report with us, they co-investigate with us, is for me a much more interesting question to explore than whether or not we'll take Facebook money. And that's up to my editors and owners to decide. But I do think Facebook money, Twitter money, Google money, it should be routed through independent boards that are democratically represented. Because when I've seen those funding pots, who gets them, how it's gotten, the kinds of strings that are tied to that money, then no, really not at the moment. And I know beggars can't be choosers. But our member model is, for me, Georgia, a more interesting and complex one that I think bears exploring. And we're in South Africa, the developing world. Huh?
I don't see you as a beggar, though. I think you seem to be, shall I say, a maverick?
Yeah, we are. But I think that the platforms try and put you into the position of having to fit their tiny boxes of how they want to give this money. And actually, I think probably Germany and some other countries in Europe have a far more a model of equality that they're trying to explore that sits better with my heart than always being a begging bowl with the platforms. That doesn't really work. Huh?
Are you suggesting, should we have public funding of private news organizations, news companies?
I'm reading a lot.
Should they be subsidized?
Obviously, there's a measure of they must pay for what they use. They should be taxed much more. They should establish mechanisms to fund the media. I think we're in the part of our world right now in 20 years into the 21st century where those are becoming far more urgent discussions. And the days of thinking that the platforms were going to be our future has shown us, as Marius's work has shown, it's been a failure. But we are at the cusp of remaking those relationships in interesting ways. Okay, we're nearing the end of our time, and I think what I'd like to get the four of you to briefly comment on is to take out your crystal ball and give me an idea of what the future looks like. What does the future look like from your different perspectives as news organizations, platforms, as people who are engaged in
in supporting freedom of expression, as people who are thinking about what are the different issues that are and challenges that we're facing, so that that also has its own trickle-down effect. Marius, I'm going to start with you. Rub that crystal ball and give me an idea of what you're thinking.
Yeah, well, let me talk about two major and dangerous trends that I see. I'm not totally pessimistic, but I think we should. I want to speak about that, and I'm going to address them in the report, simply because they are going to change journalism in ways that we haven't seen before. One we already discussed about is this trend of governments imposing all kinds of extreme regulations and laws during this time of crisis. We have seen that, and in a very high number of countries is being reported and documented by many media NGOs. And this is very important because this is going to affect on a very, very long term how media will operate. And we are not talking here only about these emergency laws where governments are trying to take over the control over to monopolize the information, the official information, but I'm talking about pieces of regulation and legislation that are going to affect the media on the long term. And here we talk about regulation of platforms, of journalism, of content online, with repercussions, with a lot of negative, mostly repercussions, I think, on the media. So I really think we should look into that and really track these developments and fight from our various positions against that. And the second, which is really, which is a very equally worrisome trend, is the financial crisis that is going to affect us all, and that is going to, I think, cripple a lot of the media outlets. We were already at the time when I think many of us, including our friends here on the panel, were building on various business models for developing independent journalism platforms. I think even those are going to be affected because of the financial crisis that will affect many of us, including those people who pay for journalism. At the same time, as I said, we start from a very bad position in which the governments are the largest spenders in the media. In most of the countries that we looked at in our research, the government is by far the largest spender in the media. Sometimes they spend double the money, the value of the private advertising market, which I think you can imagine, it says a lot about the power they have in the media. And that is not going to disappear, especially now as the discussions after the crisis will focus more and more on priorities. I see less and less space for public funding going into the media, and at the same time, I see a lot of problems with the donor money and other organizations that are funding the media, and that are extremely important in keeping journalism alive. So I'm being very sorry to be very pessimistic. I'm raising this issue simply because I think we have to seriously look at them and try to prevent what's going to come in both issues, in both areas.
Ritu, are you pessimistic or optimistic in your crystal ball?
I think a lot of what Marius has said is indeed going to be part of all our crystal balls. I don't think there is any of us can run away completely from that. But I'm going to try and, in the context of all this pessimism, from my small point of view, look at what the positive outcomes can be. I think it's all going to move towards much more digital news. I think print and broadcast, and I know that broadcast, at least in our country, has become less about getting the news and more about just debating the news every day. And so the whole point of seeking the truth had been eroded there. I think a lot of that is going to change. I think it's going to come to digital, which is both good news and bad news. It's good news because if that's where everyone's going to be, a lot of the revenue sources that were earlier going to print and broadcast are now going to be available to digital, which was earlier really at the bottom of the funnel, and very little would come to support digital news media. But I think more importantly, I think it's going to be more and more people are going to turn to pay for news they can trust. And I think that will actually, I'm hoping, lead to less of the herd mentality in news that has crept up over some time, which is, also fueled by keywords and trending words and search engine optimization, and a lot of that are coming to play into digital news. I think some of that is going to matter a little less, because I think if people are going to pay for trust, then more news media is going to focus. I know we are going to focus more and more on enterprise original news, on getting the stories rather than on just everyone going after what is now referred to as commodity news. I think those are some of the, not disagreeing with anything that Marius has said, that's true. But I think eventually when we look up, I'm hoping that some of this is going to happen, which is we're going to get better quality news. I can tell you in India, the last 1 year has been very difficult, and COVID-19 just came and made it much worse. But through all of this, we've seen some of our best journalism. So I'm taking a bit of a cue from that.
Thank you very much, Ritu. Ana Cristina.
Well, I think I agree with Marius and what Ritu said, but I will try to be positive and optimistic in this one. What we've seen, for example, here in Mexico, is that in the worst crisis of violence, journalists have come together. Even though the journalists are always working alone, when there's crisis, they're starting working together. And I think, and they are also starting working with other journalists from abroad. So that's a huge opportunity for journalism, because actually that was the moment when journalists stopped thinking about to having the prime time or the best news, but to actually inform. And I think that is what's going to happen right now. When there's a huge financial crisis, I think journalists are going to come together and they are going to bring information to the people. I do think it's a long way to go, but I do believe that now we're seeing like a lot of journalist networks that we did not see before in Guatemala, in Honduras, in Mexico, and now we're seeing it in the beginning for protection. But I know that now when the crisis comes in an economic way, they can come together also, like to bring up financing, to keep doing what they love to do, because it's also about the passion of doing journalism. So I do think it could be good also, the crisis.
Ferial.
Thank you. So I want to try and stick with my colleagues, try and keep the sunny side up. But for a couple of days, my WhatsApp has been pinging with journalists saying, "Hey, Fair, do you know if there's anyone looking for journalists because they've just lost their jobs?" I don't know what's the extent of the severance pay packets they're going to get, probably quite small in these times. So I worry that the big picture could be an extinction event, and you're actually seeing it quite close to home. But I've also been quite inspired by Arundhati Roy's essay on the pandemic as a portal, and that maybe it could be an extension event where actually the weak gets sorted from the chaff, and the high quality stuff, like Ritu says, is really supported and survives and thrives, especially if we make more democratic global and local media economic relationships.
Well, on that note, I have to say that this has been an incredible conversation. We have, I think, truly explored these issues in ways that I think made the information very accessible and interesting, and a wonderful balance, having two practitioners, having people who are engaged from the NGO community, from academia. And so I will extend on behalf of everybody my thanks to Marius Dragomir, the director of the Center for Media, Data and Society at Central European University, to Rita Kapoor, co-founder and CEO of The Quint, to Ferial Haffajee, the associate editor of the Daily Maverick based in South Africa, and to Ana Cristina Ruelas Serna, the director of Article 19 in Mexico and for Central America. To the four of you, heartfelt thanks. And also, I think, truly, in spite of everything, a positive way forward from all of us. We have truly enjoyed this conversation, and I must say that we will continue to work with you, for you, and on these issues from what we do here at UNESCO. And you can find all of these issues that we discussed on our communication and information sector website at UNESCO. You can be also part of the conversation, the larger conversation by communicating with us on our social media at UNESCO, on Twitter and our Facebook page, also on Instagram, and on others. We're also on vContact and other channels, a vast array of social media that helps us to stay connected and to communicate. Again, thank you, all of you.
Thank you, George.
Our audience, thank you. And to the audience that was significant, truly a wonderful contributions from them as well. I wish you good success. I also wish for all of you and for all of our audience to be safe and be well. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
George, just to add, I think UNESCO as well, I feel obliged to say, is doing a wonderful job these days. Really important. It plays a really important role, and it addressing a lot of these issues. I really hope you'll continue doing that, because it's extremely important. Thank you.
Yeah, all compliments are welcome. Thank you very much, Marius. Peace to all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.